Hi everyone and welcome back once again to ThursDev. I am your host, Luke, and we are rounding off our horror month this week by spotlighting a booming and somewhat newish game genre that has been recently proving its chops in delivering a solid horror experience, the asymmetrical multiplayer horror game. In video game design, especially for that of multiplayer games, great pains are taken by the responsible designer to ensure that at all times when playing a game, every player that's involved with the gameplay experience believes that the game is fair. Fairness is important in games, which probably goes without saying because conventional wisdom states that if a game is unfair, the player won't enjoy it. An unfair multiplayer game can even be unfun for the team that's given the unfair advantage. Admittedly, not everyone, if the amount of cheaters that still exist in games like Grand Theft Auto Online are to be believed, but for many, no challenge means no fun. The genre we'll be focusing on today, however, refers to a subset of games wherein the mechanics of the game are by design unfair, where one team is given an unfair advantage specifically for the purpose of challenging the other team, usually to the tune of the game being made up of multiple players against one, or a small group, that are disproportionately powered up. There are obviously going to be questions of balance, as the game must still be winnable by the underpowered team, but in a game like this, the fun comes not from the challenge of winning against an evenly matched opponent, but teaming up to gain victory over an opponent that is way out of one's league. The concept of asymmetrical gaming is by no means a new concept. It can arguably be traced back as far as the tabletop game Chainmail, which eventually evolved into what is now known as Dungeons & Dragons, where the vast majority of the game's players are pitted against an all-powerful dungeon master that would provide them with a challenge and a cohesive narrative. In D&D and the games that spawned from it, the dungeon master is tasked with giving players a challenge to overcome in order to progress forward in the narrative via monster encounters and things like traps. The entire world is dictated by the dungeon master, while each other player begins the game as a relatively underpowered adventurer, at the mercy of the game world. This isn't a perfect analog to the asymmetrical games we're going to be talking about today, but I thought that it was a good place to begin exploring the genre since historical context is always important. Outside of the realm of RPGs, the concept of the asymmetrical game is also pervasive in some casual tabletop games, like the RPG Lite board game Hero Quest, or the more recent games like Betrayal at House on the Hill, where the latter half of the game turns one player into a powerful supernatural force, attempting to defeat the rest of the game's players. Surprisingly, this sort of gameplay has not traditionally translated over in any large extent to the digital gaming space. In part probably because, in the grand scheme of things, networked multiplayer remains a fairly new experience. The Dungeon Master modes of games like Neverwinter Nights or Vampire the Masquerade Redemption attempted to inject traditional role-playing style gameplay into otherwise cooperative games, but for the most part, digital gaming has swayed in the direction of fully cooperative or competitive with balanced teams with similar abilities. The seeds of asymmetry in multiplayer were certainly sown from years back, with multiplayer games like the Natural Selection mod for Half-Life giving distinctly different abilities to one team versus another, and allowing a player on either team to take the role of an RTS-style commander which would oversee the entire battle while other players function like first-person shooter characters. But even in the examples like this, both teams are still fundamentally balanced, and meant to be played with an even number of players on either side. Perhaps one of the first games to truly embrace the concept of numerically asymmetrical gameplay was, once again returning to the same universe of licensed films I showcased in our Terror video, the Alien series, or more appropriately, Alien vs. Predator series of games, where in the multiplayer part of the game, some players would be able to use the eponymous Predator against hordes of colonial marines and xenomorphs. The first major recent example of an execution of asymmetrical gameplay that pits one overpowered character against many less powerful characters was the high-profile sci-fi Hunters vs. Monsters themed Evolve. As a first-time experience for most players, one person could take the role of a massive and frightening beast, hunting the other players while attempting to become more powerful and surviving long enough to kill all of them off. Although Evolve had the trappings, pun intended, of a frightening experience, ultimately the game was at its heart a competitive action game, however. Zombie parkour action game Dying Light also introduced a new mode entitled Be the Zombie, which allows one player to become a superpowered night zombie, hunting a group of human players. It's extremely mobile and can easily overpower and kill one of the humans, but it's vulnerable to ultraviolet light, turning the human player's flashlights into lethal weapons. Using light as a weapon was a particularly clever move on the part of Techland, the creators of Dying Light. Getting caught in the beam of a human player's flashlight would stun and ultimately seal the fate of the zombie player, incentivizing them sticking to the shadows and only pouncing when they know that another of the human's teammates are unlikely to get a fix on them. To that same end, using light as a central mechanic means that much of the rest of the game needed to be in darkness. And there's a certain primal fear that humans have when bathed in darkness, not being able to tell what's all around them, that serves to create an extra layer of terror in the game for a very little developer investment. One might consider it then a natural evolution that a studio would take the concepts put forth in that sort of an asymmetrical game and apply it to a representation of the classic slasher genre in a game form. Although the game has since gone silent, in early winter of 2014, a Kickstarter project called Last Year proposed a 5 vs 1 slasher, a game wherein a group of players would play the role of a set team of high school students trying to survive against a homicidal maniac in a campground or a school, attempting to find the necessary components to repair a truck and escape, while a 6th player takes the role of the maniac, slower than the individual student characters, but still able to teleport around the map and set up ambushes. One team fights to survive, the other team fights to kill. The concept of a game where one player can recreate the slasher genre through despawning and respawning in surprise locations, able to easily overpower the weaker team players but otherwise requiring the killer to use their head, was a powerful one, and resonated with a lot of players that have been waiting for their chance to enjoy one of those old slasher flicks that they grew up with firsthand. Last Year was successfully kickstarted and lauded by many as having finally found a formula that might translate the slasher into a video game form the way that it was meant to be played. In the following year, another project by the name of Summer Camp was also announced on Kickstarter with a common theme: teenagers on the run from a maniac in a campsite. This project would later be rebranded as Friday the 13th The Game, a project which I've given considerable attention to in the last few weeks of this year's Horror Month. Earlier this year, we were also treated to the release of a new game from Behavior Interactive called Dead by Daylight, yet another entry into this suddenly booming genre of asymmetrical horror games that, by all accounts, is a hell of a lot of fun, and shined a spotlight on how fantastic asymmetrical horror gameplay can be achieved. And as a bonus, in contrast to Friday the 13th, it's also come out with a Halloween expansion, where the killer can play Michael Myers. Laurie Strode is added to the roster of survivors, and a new Haddonfield map is added for your enjoyment. If 2015 was the year of the space sim with the release of Elite Dangerous, explosive funding of Star Citizen, and excitement surrounding the now bemoaned No Man's Sky, 2016 into 17 is the asymmetrical horror games time. As game genres go, this one's still finding its legs, but there's a fair bit of experimentation happening, and it's particularly exciting if you're a fan of fighting for your life or want to enjoy the power fantasy of the horror movie monster. Thanks very much for watching this week, and this wraps up our Horror Month edition of ThursDev. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and that you'll think about giving a shot to the asymmetrical horror game if you get the opportunity. We already have Jason and Michael Myers locked in, but who do you think is next? I'd be disappointed if we don't see Freddy Krueger or Leatherface popping up pretty soon. If you did enjoy today's video and want to see more content like it, do hit that subscribe button. It helps us by getting us that much more visibility on YouTube. Hell, share it with your friends so they can see what kind of games you'd like to start playing with them. And tell me in the comments down below what kind of horror game you think is still underrepresented, because there's still a lot of things that can be done in video games. We just need to figure out what that is. I'd love to hear from you, but for now, thank you as always for coming, and I hope to see you back here soon. Until then though, take care.